If you're one of the millions of Americans who still believes that honesty, integrity, and fidelity are the cornerstones of our democracy, we suggest you wait for another preview before getting your popcorn. In the nation's capital, a new leader has found a place in the halls of power. But her story began in the halls of high school.
We'll move on now to the presidential race with 3 candidates running. The first is Tracy Flick.
One thing that's important to know about me is that I'm an only child. My mom is really devoted to me. She likes to write letters to successful women like Elizabeth Dole and Connie Chung and ask them what advice do they have for me, Tracy, her daughter.
The next candidate for student body president is Paul Metzler.
I just don't think somebody would do something like that on purpose.
I think you did it.
And if you want to keep questioning me like this, I won't continue without my attorney present. I do not often speak with you and ask for things, but now I really must insist that you help me win the election tomorrow, because I deserve it and Paul Metzler doesn't, as you well know.
The final candidate, sophomore Tammy Metzler.
I'm attracted to the person. It's just that all the people I've ever been attracted to happen to be girls.
You should stop her. She's not qualified.
We can't both run, can we? I mean, we're brother and sister. Can we?
Tracy and I are totally in love.
In love?
Yeah.
So is this a moral situation or an ethical situation?
When I win the presidency, that means you and I are going to be spending a lot of time together.
Cast your vote for Tracy Flick next week. You won't just be voting for me. You suck! You'll be voting for yourself.
Who knew how high she would climb in life? I had to stop her.
Excuse me! Will you please be quiet?
Now.
Paramount Pictures presents an MTV Films production.
Order! Order!
Starring Matthew Broderick, Reese Witherspoon.
Hey, what happened to your eye?
What happened to your eye? Are you okay, Mr. McAllister?
I'm fine.
On the road to greatness. Never underestimate an overachiever.
Looks like you could use a cupcake.
Election. Cast your vote.
Or don't vote at all!
Please give it up for producer David Gale. Come on up. First off, thank you so much for coming tonight. And I have questions. I hope you have questions. And Matt, thank you so much for making this happen. I really appreciate it. And Matt is the writer-director of American Murder, too. I'm just going to plug your movie. So when it comes out, you need to see it. Yeah, fine. Mr. Gale, look, my watching it again, there's so many questions. I'll try to just ask a simple one. The movie has such a very specific tone. And if it hadn't been done right, it could have been disastrous because it's so direct, so frank. It's dealing with a lot. How did you guys, when you guys decided to develop this property and you read Alexander Payne's script, how did you know, like, this is something we want to do at MTV Films, this is going to work out? What were your thoughts?
Well, it wasn't like that at all, actually. The project started with a book by Tom Perrotta. So it was actually sitting in a drawer, unpublished at that time, and 2 producers named Albert Berger and Ron Yerxa, who knew about the book, brought it to me, and I recently started, maybe I'd been at MTV a few years, and they just thought it would be a great book. And the interesting thing about the book is that I can't remember how many different characters, but there's like 8, and so that first person point of view goes about 8 different people, and he had based it on the Reagan election. So it was actually sort of an interesting parallel to a time back then. And so when we bought the book, MTV, we were known for Beavis and Butthead and Jackass, and we were doing, Varsity Blues movies that were sort of really, truly teen movies for the most part. And this was a potentially teen movie, and we really debated what to do with it. And we had Albert and Ron actually and I were at Sundance, and we saw Alexander Payne's first movie called Citizen Ruth. And he loved the book, and he came, and they came to us and said, well, he has a different point of view. So we developed it with Alexander and Jim Taylor, who wrote it with him. So it really wasn't Alexander's initial project, and it could have gone either way. Because we really thought it was really a choice between this and a very straightforward sort of traditional teen movie.
And what was it? So just out of curiosity, because Alexander Payne that tone carries over into some of his other movies, that very, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's funny he's from Nebraska, but just very clear-eyed view of human nature.
Yeah.
And and it was there in Citizen Ruth. How did you know that he was the right person for the project?
Well, the book is a satire, and so doing satires, you can do Clueless, which is a much more traditional kind of MTV teen movie. And we took the chance on this, and honestly, for a long time, it felt like we made a big mistake. And because as you can imagine, when the studio started seeing the dailies on this, they were kind of freaking out. They really didn't know what to make of it. I don't know why. They had the script. They could have read the script. They did read the script. But I think Alexander had a lot of acclaim at that moment just for his first film. And they were like, okay, well, maybe we'll see what happens. And they were kind of mortified, and they really hated the movie and decided they were going to dump it. And so there's another story there that I can tell you. But
well, and if that comes up, but it's fine. Just side note, and then I have one or two more questions, and then we're going to go out to you guys. This is one of those movies, and I was in my early 20s when it came out, and as I remember, just tell me if I'm remembering it correctly, I remember this being something that everybody was in film school and everybody who saw it loved, but it didn't get a lot of promotional backing from the studio. And so what was that feeling like? Did you feel like you had something good when the movie was done?
I could just go on way too long, and I won't. But I will.
Let me switch mics.
That's okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Do I need a mic?
Yeah, it's still good with the mic.
Oh, you know what? Because we're recording it, if that's okay.
Oh,
yeah. Sorry.
Well, we don't want that.
That's what, yeah, Chuck is.
Or the 12 other people who might see it. But, I think that watching this movie come about there were so many stories. We could probably write a book about making this movie. But it was also, a very unusual process, because Alexander, the way he shoots a lot. And it was very long, and it went on for months of he sort of sees himself as a sculptor. So you start with this big piece of concrete, or whatever, clay or whatever it was, marble, and he chips away at it. So at first you're kind of like, whoa, what is this? It's very long. It was all kinds of scenes you'll never see. And so we didn't know, and then in fact, the first screening of the movie, the first public screening, the audience kind of left in droves. That scene where he says, her pussy gets so wet, literally half the theater walked out, because they thought they were going to see a movie with Matthew Broderick. It's MTV. And it was like, what the hell is this movie? And the studio was very upset, and it was a very different ending. So the ending that originally was on this film was not this ending.
Can I ask what it was?
Absolutely. In fact, if you do a little YouTube research, you could probably find it someplace. Has anyone ever seen the original? You have seen. Yes. You are a YouTube researcher then, yes. The original ending was closer to the book, and I can't even remember everything that was in the original ending, but he then gets a job at a Saturn dealership, and he's sitting in sort of the coffee room with the other with the other car dealer, whatever they call them. And somebody comes in and says, Mr. McAllister or Jim, you have a customer, she wants to see you. And he walks out, and it's Tracy Flick pretending or saying she needs a car. And he's looks at her, and she says, well, I'm thinking of buying a car for college, and he says, okay, let's go take a test drive. And they get in the car, and you're just like, what's going to go happen? And she's driving, and she drives to her house, which sits behind the power plant. And she says, can you wait here a minute? And she goes inside to the house, and he's sitting there saying, what's going on? And she comes out with her yearbook, and she asked him to sign it. And he starts signing the yearbook, Dear Tracy, and the music comes up. And it's basically this really strange, melancholy ending about you had seen before Tracy not getting her yearbook signed. And so it was a very odd, but very kind of I still love the ending, but it's not the ending this is. And so we went off, and Alexander wrote 3 more endings, one where he becomes a park ranger, this one, and I forget what the other one is. This is the one we shot.
So that's it. So the movie was actually very much sculpted and edited down, and so it was not. It had to be found a little bit.
But that's the way he does it. He shoots a lot, and it's all there. And now watching this movie now, 20-something years later, I realized that that this has so much more. I mean, I didn't even see some of the stuff that's in there right now. And you'll notice also little things like garbage being a very big theme. Garbage, garbage trucks, the garbage, throwing the garbage on the ground. There's so much about that, and there's so much about sort of temptation, the apples on the trees and eating apples. Like there's a lot there that is much more sort of thought through by Alexander and Jim than you would ever imagine. If you watch it over and over again, you're like, there are a lot of things, and even again, I got to speak to Alexander, so I knew what he was doing, but there were a lot of things in there that you won't notice on the first time seeing. You might not notice on the 10th time seeing.
I have one more question, and then I'm going to go out to folks. One of the things in doing my research was, so you went to Stanford, then you went to NYU Law School, then you started at a talent agency, and then I was reading you worked for Ridley Scott and Gale Ann Hurd, and as a producer, I just wanted to ask, it sounded like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you worked for Gale Ann Hurd, who had worked with James Cameron, produced Aliens, all these movies in the 80s for a number of years. What are some of the things you learned from her, just in terms of what a producer does and what a good producer is?
That's a great. I'm glad you asked that. Nobody asked that question. And in fact, Gale Hurd, who wrote the story for Terminator, actually, and was married to Jim Cameron. But she was somebody I actually met because when I was in business affairs at ICM and talent agency, I negotiated her Terminator deal. And so she remembered me years later when she was looking for someone to run her company, and she hired me. And I didn't know anything creative. I was a lawyer, but I'd wanted to be a producer. One day I said, I'll be a producer, but I got to get out of this law thing. And she actually gave me the opportunity to run the company, and actually learned a lot from the people who worked for me as the president, those creative people, and I pretty much absorbed it all. But really, Gale is the most thoughtful, hardworking, honest person, but she's tough. And so she got a reputation around town for being really tough. And it's interesting, there's a different day and age when women producers were very rare in this town. And so there was always this kind of need to sort of be a little harder than some of the others because you would never make it in this town. So I actually got to see up close and personal with her how great a producer she was, and I got to just learn everything. And she threw me in the fire to see if I could survive, and I did, and learned a lot. And then it led to my getting the job at running MTV Films. So, was
there any advice she gave you, or like one lesson that you kept in mind when you went?
Oh, well, her big lesson was really hard one, which was every single day we had to document everything that ever happened all day long, and then give her a memo saying everything that happened. It'd take like 3 hours a day just to tell her what I did all day long. And it was hard, but it was also sort of almost like writing my own book every day about what it was like to run a company.
Huh.
So not something I would ever do to somebody else, but kind of good for me.
All right, let's go out to the audience. Questions for Mr. Gale? Yes.
So on June 7th, Tom's new book comes out called Tracy Flick Can't Win. And I'm a huge fan of the film, but I never read the original source. And it's interesting, the ending I saw, what you discussed, that is more kind of melancholy and kind of smaller. I feel like this book is about Tracy still in her hometown, so trying to break out. But the movie's ending is very big. Like, Tracy has obviously made it. So I feel like reading the book, if you're looking at the movie's ending, is a little harder to swallow, that Tracy hasn't really, become president or what have you. So I don't know, I guess, well, for one, has anyone discussed even turning that into a film yet? Or
yeah, they're developing it at Paramount.
Okay, all right, yeah. And has anyone...
Tom has written a screenplay.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
I guess that's my question. My first question was
I'm not involved in on that one. Albert and Ron are, but they actually developed Tom's other book, The Leftovers, for HBO.
Oh, okay, that's right.
One of his many books.
Yes.
I was just wondering wondering if you could talk about the casting process a bit, particularly, obviously, with the public's perception of who Broderick and Witherspoon were at the time, and one, how they were selected, and how they related to the material, both in the moment and when it was finally released, and how that played out for them and how they're selected.
Well, I'll tell you that Matthew Broderick was not Paramount's first choice. They wanted us to go to much bigger names at the time. And, because he was, Ferris Bueller, there was a sort of and by the way, I should go back and say that Alexander has some interesting instincts, and they tend to be not your normal commercial instincts. And so I think that you'll see it in the casting, but these were not his first choices all the time. And his first choice was David Strathairn to play the Matthew Broderick character. And we all kind of fought him on that. And didn't think that was what we wanted. And I was working at MTV. You have to understand that. My job was to make pop culture movies. And so David Strathairn in the lead of an MTV film didn't make any sense. Whereas Matthew Broderick, known for, Ferris Bueller, that we really loved. And Reese was very young, that she had only done a couple of movies, but, it was so clear. I mean, she was perfect. She was the embodiment. But most of the other kids were from either local kids recently discovered. Chris Klein was this might have been his first film or his second film. It was before American Pie and all that. And then the other kids, they were a lot of Omaha people. And Alexander's kind of had a lot of these people have become like his perfect, the cast he uses sometimes.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, David. Can you talk about what makes, in your opinion, a successful producer-director relationship? Obviously, this was a movie that was hard to get made, and you definitely did a great job of protecting the vision from what the studio could have done to it. So I was just curious to ask what that relationship looks like.
I'm just going to repeat the question for the camera. It's a great question. So the question is, and Matt, correct me if I butcher the question, but what makes a good producer-director relationship, especially if the studio wants to come down or fight the vision of the director?
Yeah, I haven't thought about that very much, but it's not a hard question to answer, in my opinion. I think the producer's job, first of all, is finding the material, because that's the first thing you do, is looking for things that you want to make. And so this book that came around was something that I could see being a great, interesting film that I'd never seen anything like it before. And when we got Alexander involved, as with almost any film that I've been involved in, you then hand the creative sort of reins to the director, especially after in this case, he wrote the screenplay, co-wrote the screenplay, and we really did love the screenplay. And then it's his, right? And my job as a producer is essentially to facilitate that vision. If I made a mistake in hiring a director, that's on me. And I've had that happen before. But even then, you're sort of like, that's your job, to support the director, unless they do something awful and are doing all kinds of things that make the thing go way over budget or over schedule in ways that you really have to rein in and just to be, sort of prudent. But even then, the job is to sort of stick with your director and try to help him make the film he told you he was going to make or she made. And so then you build a trust, and the trust is what is going to get you through everything that comes after it, especially the bad stuff from the studio, financiers, or somebody else, because then you're there to give them the bad news. You're there to sort of help them understand that getting this movie made is a collaborative effort, that people have put money behind it, that I and my producing partners have spent more time than they have on this project usually. And it's important to us too, so why would I want to not do something that's going to help the film? And so first and foremost, build that trust. And then hopefully, get people out of their way. But then when like this happens, and there was a lot. I mean, there was stuff that happened on this movie. A kid was killed in the making of, not on this, somebody who was in town, there was an accident, and you had to deal with that. The scene with the apple trees and the bees, they had the worst snowstorm ever in October in Omaha, and all the trees fell down, and all of the branches fell down. And so we had to paste leaves on trees and apples on trees. And so, you go through all of that, everything that you could imagine, going wrong and then more. And so, when they see you're fighting for them, casting, we got in some pretty major discussions, like I said, with Alexander and casting. At the end of the day, he was still sort of younger, and so we could have exerted a lot of power, but you ultimately wanted him to make the decision. Even reshooting the whole ending, clearly that wasn't something he had anticipated. What director goes to a screening, and even if the news isn't great, you're not going to be like, oh, I need to reshoot my ending. That just generally doesn't happen. So that was kind of pushed on him. But I think he quickly, when given the opportunity to write more endings, I think he saw that he had a chance to do it even better. And ultimately, I think he did a great job, and it is a better movie as a result.
David, I wanted to ask a question because I tried to do my research, and you also were in a really interesting point and moment. When you were at MTV, you also started to head up the digital side of it, I was reading, right when all of the social media was just starting to happen. So you were, in a way, at the nexus of the transition from what movie making and media had been pre-internet, pre-social media, and then transitioning all the way to what it is now. And it's a big question. I don't quite know how to ask it. But do you have any insight into how you think social media and the theatrical experience can work together? Is there a way for them not to compete, but to actually help each other?
That is a big question. When I left, it was watching this movie, I realized, no cell phones, no social media, and the nostalgia that I have. I don't know about the rest of you. Some of you are too young to even know that there was a time when you didn't have cell phones and social media. But I felt like, the movie experience at that time was very much a ritual that especially high school kids and younger kids would go every weekend. And social media was literally social media, like it would be, or social. It would be you going to school on Monday, saying what you saw, anticipating, watching the trailers, cable television, MTV. And I think the sort of ability to sort of, allow a movie to grow and become sort of like anticipated, the trailers, the promotions, and we did a lot on MTV. And so on that level, I think we're missing a zeitgeist opportunity that we used to have, because every weekend, 2 or 3 movies would come out, sometimes more, but like 2 or 3 people that age were looking for. And they were sort of talking about it. And then afterwards they talked about it. And when it came out on home video. And so if you are old enough to remember when this movie came out, or even when you saw it on home video, there was a mutual experience for people. What's interesting is that was more palpable and more powerful to me than the digital, sort of ephemeral nature of digital media, where every second there's something new getting your attention. That being said, obviously there are things that digital media can do. And I moved over into digital media in part. There's a long story there, which I'm not going to tell, but it was a bittersweet, but still good experience when I left. But I did see the beginning of, that was the year that YouTube started and Facebook started. When I went into that, I'm like, this is going to change everything. And in fact, looking at whatever that number of years is now, 15 years ago, MTV barely exists. MTV was your social media platform in a way. And so I sort of saw the beginning of the end and was concerned for my company, which I loved, and working there was fantastic. And, it killed MTV. MTV killed the
video, killed the radio,
killed the radio, and then digital killed like a brand like MTV. So I don't know that it's been a good thing, frankly, for movies, especially this kind of experience.
Well, that's why I asked the question. Is I still don't think that it's people have discovered how to make it work for the theatrical experience. So there you go. That's where we're at. Someone's got to figure it out. But my other question, and I'll go out again, is I went to high school in the mid-90s, and I have experiences like my friends and I watching Beavis and Butthead, and we loved it. And our parents being like, this is the stupidest thing. Like, why do you guys like this? Or like Jackass. And we're like, no, it's actually more intelligent than you think. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, because Jackass and Beavis and Butthead have aged surprisingly well. Like the generations that like it, that understand, you were talking about satire. Like Beavis and Butthead Do America is surprisingly satirical. And Jackass, there's a surprising element of self-awareness to it. So I'm just wondering, when you were there making those movies, did you feel that was there? Like, how did you feel you could let people know, actually, this is way more intelligent than you think it is?
You're touching on one of the bigger struggles that I had to deal with all the time, because by working in a place like MTV, your job was to understand sort of the mentality and the attitudes, the experiences of being young. But I was older, so I had to sort of almost channel that in some way and have great, very diverse staff. Like I had people, in our staff that really understood their own generation. We had a very diverse group of people, sexual identity to race to to gender, and that helped me understand that this was not like one America, that I think was often the problem with studios, and they tended to really make things that were reflecting often what the executives, who were pretty white, mostly male, were thinking. And so I think that MTV's job was to be much more attuned to what culture was. And so I had to listen to the people who worked for me, and I had to pay close attention. And sometimes those people in those suits in those offices had no idea what we were doing. And by the way, most of the critics didn't either. So the movies like, Varsity Blues or Save the Last Dance or Beavis and Butthead or Jackass, those were not movies that were well received at all by critics. But the audiences liked them because the job was to sort of get in the mindset of a young person, The Wood or Better Luck Tomorrow.
I was about to say, the number of directors and creative voices that you fostered in MTV, like Shonda Rhimes, was that Crossroads?
Yeah.
Was that the Britney Spears?
Crossroads, yes. Britney Spears. That was also the greatest fun thing about the job, was like I was looking for filmmakers who were also kind of emerging and cutting edge and understood their audiences and not sort of the tribe. Every time we were forced to do the traditional movie maker, it was bad, pretty much. It was a very difficult time. There were a few movies that, to this day, it upsets me to watch them because I knew the director was not the right director. How do you have a guy, Jonathan Lynn, a 65-year-old white guy who done My Cousin Vinny, do The Fighting Temptations? And it's like, what?
He did Clue, though, also.
What was that?
He did Clue also, didn't he, though? But even so...
Yeah, but still
it still doesn't match. I hear you.
You have a gospel
I didn't make a point. I know.
Movie takes place in the Deep South by that guy.
No, you're right.
It was this kind of thing that, he's a good director for what he did, but then that's just the kind of disconnect. Right. So it all goes to your same question, which is like, you have to align the creative people and with the vision for the audience that you're serving.
And and I saw your question, so I'm going to get you friend. But it's interesting what you're saying. I just thought, like, was the studio sometimes bipolar, and we want you to do this? No, we don't want you to do this. We want it to be a conservative approach with a trusted filmmaker. No, we want you to find a young voice. Was that a constant struggle?
It was a constant struggle. It was a fight all the time. But at the end of the day, when we started to get success, they started to listen more. So even something like Napoleon Dynamite, which was an acquisition, they fought us to the point where they wouldn't even distribute it. So we went and made a deal with Fox to distribute it, and that was like a big war because we were all Viacom owned both Paramount and MTV, and we said, well, if you're not going to do it, we'll go to your competitors at Fox to do it. So Fox Searchlight was the ones that actually released Napoleon Dynamite, big success. But Paramount made sure that they owned half the movie. So they got the benefit, but none of the effort. So it was just one of those interesting things that happens in Hollywood.
Frank.
When this movie came out, did teenagers like it? Like, do they even get why it's funny?
Was anyone a teenager when it came out?
I saw this when I was 17.
What did you think?
In the theater, and I loved it. So I walked out of the theater quoting it already.
It's a subversive movie, though, and it didn't do well financially at the box office. It really only got its legs after on home video and when the critics came, because we were told by the studio that they hated it so much they were actually going to dump it, put it in 4 movie theaters as a requirement to get their home video and pay cable deals. And so I got the memo saying this, and I'm like, oh my God, is it that bad? And then they wouldn't let us go to Sundance. We were offered the prime spot at Sundance. They said this movie is going to be such a disaster if you bring it to Sundance, then we'll never be able to, they called it sort of trick it open by making people feel like maybe it's a good movie. And so they did everything wrong. And then, of course, years later, when it became sort of a critical success and people seen it, they were like, they took credit. We fought really hard, the filmmaker group. And
for whatever it's worth, I don't know if you've ever read Akira Kurosawa's autobiography, but he tells the same story that the Toho, when he made Rashomon, they were like, this is the worst movie ever made. Like, we're just going to bury it. Like, what's all this multiple? And then when it won Venice, he saw a TV show where the studio executive was like, and I was the one.
To this day, when I see the studio executives who take credit for it, I just like, okay, that works.
Yes, Chuck, and then question back.
I'm curious what it's like to have worked on so many films, 15, 20, 25 years ago, and then to be able to see the longevity of them now, even if they weren't initially successful, to see how they've grown in esteem through home video, through cable. This film now has a 4K master as part of the Criterion collection. I'm just wondering what that's like as a producer to see those, like that these films grow in esteem.
That's a nice question. I guess the pain and suffering that you go through during the making of this stuff doesn't let you sort of enjoy it as much as you should, and it's a lesson to young filmmakers to try to enjoy it and believe what you're doing. And even if people are telling you it's stupid and bad, don't take it too personally, because it doesn't really matter what they think. But it does feel good, and I'm just very fortunate. I got to work in the most amazing company, and I got enough freedom to make a lot of these films, and it was at a time when movies did matter. So and especially movies for young people mattered. So I think that it's hard to imagine what it would be like now, because you don't have that platform, and because you don't have this kind of cultural moment where people are watching the same thing at the same time and all talking about it. So I feel very fortunate about it, and a lot of great feelings and experiences at the time as well, and I love the people that I worked with. So I think more about like how much I enjoyed the people I worked with than I do about like, oh, I made that movie, but this feels good. It feels nice to see it again and know it's good.
I was going to ask, one of my favorite things about the movie, and one thing that's so surprising, is that Paul is like a sweetheart throughout the whole thing. I think typically movies like this, he's like a douchebag or a bully or like a bro-y jock. Was that always the case, that he was just like a really sweet dum-dum? Or was that like something you guys talked about?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the 4 main characters, and again, if you read the novella, which is it's a small novel, there are multiple characters, and they all sort of represented different sort of types of characters. What's interesting is, in reflection, I read a lot of reviews in the early days where Tracy was seen as like the villain, but in retrospect, she was really the one who was victimized in a way. And so many, and people weren't recognizing that 20-something years ago. They see the whole movie in a different light. You also have a lot of, Hillary Clinton there, even though it was before Hillary Clinton was pretty much a public figure in the same way. And so the parallels are interesting today.
I mean, we touched on it. It's funny you were saying the Reagan election. And it's funny, I watching it again, I was like, I had forgotten, it had been a few years since I've seen this. I had forgotten that Tammy gets crossed out. I had somehow misremembered that she was a bit of a Nader spoiler, but it's just funny to watch a movie just before 2000 where you have the counts and the recounts. and all the shenanigans that are happening that nobody knows about, and like a third-party candidate that everybody loves. And when 2000 happened and politics went from where it went, does anybody, or did you guys involved with the election, did anyone talk about how prescient the movie was?
Not really. I think that in looking at it today and all the elections we've been through, there's a lot in it just in American politics.
Right.
And that's why I think when Tom wrote the book based on sort of an earlier political time, it's like this, it just repeats itself. There's always characters like this. There's so many things that you could see in even now, right? Or in the last couple of elections. It's kind of getting almost more real to me.
Yeah,
this is a satire, but now you wish we were living in a satire because it's even worse.
I know people have said this before, but I love Network. It's one of my favorite movies. But the funny thing now is that Network seems very tame, and it's almost like we've jumped the shark in terms of satire and what's actually happening in real life. And I wonder, how could someone make an effective satire now?
I think the difference is that this is a very small movie. And so it's a tiny little microcosm of a high school election. It's not meant to sort of reflect sort of necessarily the big picture. It does that through the small details of human beings and human foibles. I mean, in watching it again, I realize how much empathy I have for everybody. Everybody has a bad day. Everybody sort of can get to that point where they just do something irrational. And I think that Alexander did such a great job of sort of making you understand all 4 points of view, and understanding how we all can be any of those people at some point.
Absolutely. So we'll take one question or two more, or I'll wrap up. Does anyone else have any? Yeah, Frank, you'll be final question.
It seems like part of your job when you were putting all these kind of classic movies together was like knowing what was cool in that moment. Like, what is cool now? Like,
do I seem cool? I'm not cool. I wasn't cool then either. I hired cool people, and I think that's the biggest job of somebody who runs a division in a company, of any company, is hire great people to help you become better than you are. And so whether that was through music or culture, I mean, I wouldn't have been able, I made a movie called The Original Kings of Comedy. In a million years, I wouldn't have known about that movie. And that movie was made for like $3 million, made $150 million at box office. All those incredible comedians became famous. That wasn't me. I ended up making the decision and fighting for it, and we paid for it, but it was only because I had great people who said, you need to see these guys, and we should do this as a movie. And so I don't really think that I'm capable of it, frankly. I have my own taste. So right now when I'm producing or I'm doing something, it becomes much more about what I would love to do and what I want to see as a movie. I also want it to be commercial and to, people to see it. But I wasn't cool, and I'm still not.
And am I remembering that Original Kings of Comedy? That was directed by Spike Lee, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
It was. Little note, Spike Lee had never even seen the live action Original Kings of Comedy, but he knew about it, and he came in and he directed like off the seat of his pants because he's just such a great director. So he was able to capture it, but that was all. I mean, his directing was good, but it was those four guys.
Right. Yeah. It was Cedric the Entertainer, Steve Harvey.
Yeah, DL's the one usually people forget, and of course
Bernie Mac. Bernie Mac, yes. So the final question, Mr. Gale, we ask everybody who comes in here is, a lot of people in our audience, and people will see this, they are movie makers. They believe in movies, and they still do, despite all the COVID and the tumult and the change. Given the career that you've had, just what advice would you give people if they believe in cinema and they're starting now, and or storytelling, or just what advice can you give folks?
Well, I guess I give different advice to people who want to be in the business than people who just love movies. I mean, if you love movies, you're in a great moment because in some ways you have more than ever. It's just a different experience of watching them. So I hope that the movie theater experience comes back, because I don't think it's the same. I mean, even looking at this on, in a big screen was so much more exciting. So I hope people continue to do this kind of stuff and go to movie theaters. as people who want to be in the business, unfortunately, I think you kind of have to accept that people are okay with seeing movies in any kind of platform. I personally like seeing them here, but I'm also staying at home watching them. So I'd have to give a whole separate talk about what I think about building a career today. But for you guys and people who love seeing movies, and I'm just appreciative that you guys came out and that still want to see this movie. And, all the ones that have, so many of those trailers, and God, I got to see that. Yeah. I don't have very profound advice.
Okay. Well, you're very down to earth, though. So I want to thank you so much for giving your time and also for making one of the great movies. So, you're very self-effacing, but this is one of the great movies. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.